in from. We're kind of getting a few things situated, and then we'll get started as soon as everybody is here and we have kind of a quorum. We'll let a few more people trickle in. It usually takes a little bit for it to let everybody in. Copenhagen, fantastic. Switzerland, still haven't been to Switzerland. One of these days. If you have any recommendations, Chloe, let me know. I love Copenhagen. Hey, Hans, great to see you. Always love seeing you in the audience. Ithaca, New York, okay. Pretty good representation globally. That's great. Glad you're able to be with us. Love to see if this is anyone's first time at a Greenlight Guru event. Feel free to drop that in the chat. We'll just get started in just a moment. We're letting everybody trickle in here. All right, Elizabeth, I'm glad you liked the demos. That's great. You'll have to let us know if there's anything about the demos that we should alter. I think some of that is being workshopped kind of as we speak. So if you have any feedback, we always love feedback. Welcome, Nigel. Glad you're here for the first event. Last time I asked that, I think somebody said this was their 40th event, and I owe them something. So maybe that's the case. I don't know. We'll see here in a minute. All right. Looks like we've got everybody, so we'll go ahead and get started. We're a minute after, which is perfect because it looks like maybe our platform has let everybody in. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Today's webinar is Cybersecurity and Hidden Threats in Medical Devices, Real-World Risks and the Evolving Regulatory Landscape. My name is Etienne Nichols. I'll be the moderator for today's session. So just a few housekeeping items before we dive into our presentation. First, I want to ask you to participate. I always love seeing the chat and the discussion that goes on there. So sometimes there's a lot of really good knowledge sharing and interactions that happen there. So please use the chat to connect with fellow attendees and to make those comments. As long as you play nice, then I love to see all of those things. The Q&A tab, if you look at the top right, there's the chat, but there's also the Q&A tab. That is where you can ask questions that you specifically want us to ask our presenters, Ken and Joe, here today. So if you have questions, feel free to use that for the presenters. The other thing is, even if you don't have a specific question for the Q&A section, maybe you don't think, my question's not relevant, feel free to look at the Q&A section and upvote or thumbs up those questions, and I'll try to prioritize the ones that are most relevant to you who are listening. Secondly, we always get this question, so I always want to address this. We will be sending out the full recording and the presentation slides to all the registrants afterwards, so watch your inbox for that follow-up email. We'll make sure we get to that. At Greenlight Guru, our mission is to improve the quality of life through our work in the medical device industry, which is likely a shared goal of many of you here today. We host these free webinars to share valuable insights, learn from top industry experts, and to showcase our industry-leading solutions. Our software is designed to help medtech companies bring life-changing products to patients faster, more efficiently, and with less risk. And our software suite includes solutions for product development, quality management, and clinical data management. And they're all tailored specifically for the medical device industry. So if you're interested in learning or joining over 1,000 leading medical device companies that trust Greenlight Guru, feel free to visit www.greenlight.guru for your personalized demo after today's webinar. Someone already said in the chat that they love the demo, they love to see what we are offering. So I encourage you to reach out as well. A lot of people don't know that we have software, and so I think it's important to just kind of highlight that, because that is one of the ways in which we are trying to make your life easier as a med tech professional. I would like to introduce our co-presenters, Ken Zalevsky and Joe Silvia. Ken is the CEO of Vigilant Ops, so if you want to look at the slide and learn a little bit more about what they do, and of course he may have a little bit to add as well. But Ken's journey in medical device cybersecurity began with over 20 years at Bayer Healthcare, where he led medical device cybersecurity. And during that time, he saw firsthand challenges of securing critical healthcare technologies and the growing need for greater transparency in the software supply chain. That's why he founded Vigilant Ops, and to help his organization navigate those complexities and stay ahead of the evolving threats. Ken has had the privilege of working closely with the FDA, Homeland Security, and global regulatory bodies to drive industry-wide security advancements. As the chair of an organization focused on global standards, he collaborates with national and international stakeholders to strengthen the software supply chain and improve cybersecurity practices across the healthcare industry. His mission is to ensure that medical device manufacturers and healthcare organizations have the tools they need to protect patients and critical infrastructure. So we're going to get into some of that today during the discussion. But I'd also like to introduce Joe Silvia, who is the CEO of MedWare Cyber. Joe also has over 20 years of experience in the field of cybersecurity, and he specializes in embedded and medical devices. His mission is to ensure the utmost security and privacy of connected medical technologies and the Internet of Things devices, IoT devices, safeguarding patient safety and health outcomes. He has extensive experience in medical device software, device security, mobile apps, wireless technology, QNX software, and Windows IoT enterprise, wireless coexistence, interoperability, MDDS, and emerging technology. I'm not going to, do this to him, but I would venture to say if you wanted to put $20 on whether or not he can answer the question, I've done that in the past and I've lost money, but I know I think I'd win on this one today. He has a lot of experience. He's well versed in cybersecurity regulations and standards such as the NIST framework, FIPS 62304, 21 CFR Part 820, Part 11, GXP quality management systems, ISO 1345-2016, risk management, ISO 14971. Just the word salad's just going to keep coming at you because he has the experience. So I just want to let you know and stress that. So I'm going to stop for just a minute. Ken, Joe, great to have you with us today. How are you doing today?
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Etienne. It's great to be here, and great again to see you, Joe. And always have good, lively discussions. Looking forward to it. So thank you. And I'll corroborate Joe's a walking encyclopedia when it comes to a lot of the stuff that's happening today in cybersecurity. So looking forward to a great discussion.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
so before we get too far down the road, I do want to ask a few polls just so we can kind of get a feel for who's in the audience. We usually have hundreds of people in the audience, and it's a wide range. So we like to run these polls sometimes to see where you are at, and then what we're trying to accomplish here. Because today's going to be a little bit more fluid. It's not going to be a presentation where we're just talking to you. It'll be a little bit more of a conversation, and we do want to answer those questions. We already have one actually. Rashid actually already asked, "Are you going to talk about S-bombs?" So I assume that's probably going to be on the topic. But I want to share a poll. Let's see here. Let's go to the polls tab. There should have been a polls tab that just popped up between the chat and Q&A tab where you can start answering this poll. And the question is, what is your level of familiarity with S-bombs, software bill of materials? So to answer your question, Rashid, we are going to talk about S-bombs, and we'd love to know where you are in this spectrum right now. Are you somewhat familiar? Are you very familiar? Are you an expert? And if you are an expert, I expect to see some comments, provided we play nicely and so on. So we got at least 3 experts in the audience. That's great. To answer the question in the chat, the recording has started. We are going to be recording from the very beginning. Yeah. All right, we'll give it just a little bit longer. Just make sure we get everything. Looks like somewhat familiarity seems to be the ruling majority here. So I'll close that out. We have just 2 more polls, so bear with us as we go through this. 2 more polls. Next one is if you are using, so there were a few that aren't, but if you are using S-bombs, how are you currently managing them? Are you manually tracking these S-bombs? And I might just kind of look at you, Ken and Joe, just from the previous poll. Is that what you've seen in the industry, kind of a good cross-section of what you typically would see?
Yeah, I mean, I can go first. Yes, that is exactly what we see. I mean, we see some familiarity, not too many folks on the expert side, and even some folks in the very early stages, kind of learning what S-bombs are all about. We say that S-bombs have their own life cycle, and everybody's at a different spot when it comes to that life cycle.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So
for me too.
Go ahead, Joe.
Sorry. Yeah, for me, it's the same thing. I think everybody's at a different place in their S-bomb journey. And what I see on the screen here in this poll is very consistent with what I've been witnessing as well.
Okay. And those of you, I put this other in the poll at the very bottom. So if you have another way of managing these, I would just put that for my own curiosity. So feel free to put that in the chat, how you are using these, just to kind of give us a little bit more diversity here. So some automated internal tools. Okay, great. All right. Looks like we probably have a quorum there, so I'm going to stop sharing that. And then the very last poll that I have is one about FDA submission. So just where are you in the FDA submission cycle? And sometimes I wish we could kind of thread this to where we know the people who are either using SBOMs or not using SBOMs and where they are, just so we can address that a little bit as well. But just if you could help us out here, just give us a feel for where you are in the audience. Hopefully Joe and Ken, they're making some mental notes here to where we are.
No.
All right. Okay. So a lot are still early development. Some are actively preparing. We have some that are approved. So those of you who are approved, we might be interested to just kind of see your participation in the chat. Love to hear some of your success stories or failure stories if you're open to sharing. Not everybody is, but sometimes those yield the most fruit. So, okay. All right. So Joe, Ken, you probably have an idea now where we're coming from and who's in the audience. So let's go ahead. I'm going to close this out and let's set the stage a little bit. And Joe, maybe we can start with you. I'm curious if you can walk us through a real world cyber attack or vulnerability involving a medical device that may have shocked even the experts. Part of the reason I asked this is what made it such a wake up call for the industry to start putting a lot of these relatively new, or at least newer to medical device regulations in place. Do you have something you could share on that?
Yeah,
front?
yeah, sure. I think there was one most recently, right, where there was an issue with some a device that actually had some elements in the software and even in the firmware that were from from a foreign entity, right? They were from a country that that was actually embedding some components into the medical device that the medical device manufacturers weren't aware of, right? And it wasn't caught doing normal testing, right? And so as they drilled in deeper and they started looking at something like an SBOM, they started realizing that some of these components were out there and they were like, whoa, we didn't even know this was in our software, let alone, and all these other different devices across, the medical device industry. So it was not only in one medical device, but it was in multiple medical devices where they found these pieces of software and even some firmware that weren't part of, what you would normally see. And they're like, wow, that's an eye opener. And it really started making the industry look more deeply into where components are actually being sourced from, in other words, right? Where's the software actually coming from? Where are the different components in the software coming from? So they really started looking at these things. And that was a big eye opener. One of the things I do a lot of FDA kind of like mock inspections and also a lot of auditing. And this is what I see in my travels, right? Where you start looking at these different components and, it's an eye opener to a lot of companies out there, medical device manufacturers, what's actually in their software that they're not aware of. So that's what I've been seeing a lot. And I think the regulations are going in lockstep with that now. And they're getting even increasingly more stringent, right? In terms of, hey, let's look a deeper dive into the software and seeing where it's sourced from, particularly where, a lot of firms are using open source software components, right? In different libraries, right? And they're not aware of like the actual software maintainers.
That makes sense. Ken, I'm curious if you could add a little bit of color. I'm curious if you could comment on which attack vectors are most commonly exploited in today's connected medical device and maybe why these persist despite growing awareness. I mean, obviously people are more aware than ever before.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's a great question. And Joe, I love your answer. And that's, you pointed out a couple of really important concepts there. One is if we just kind of back up a little bit and say, let's level set and talk about what is a software bill of materials. I mean, most of the folks on the call know and maybe are using a software bill of materials. But, if you think about it analogously to a list of ingredients on a food package, you can see why it's really, really important to understand what's inside there, right? And so Joe pointed that out, right? The purpose of the software bill of materials is to provide that transparency to the folks who are consuming the product, right? Unfortunately, you can't flip over a medical device and look at the back of it and see what's inside there, right? So the software bill of materials gives you that access. And going back to thinking about the watershed events, or to Etienne's point, why does this persist in healthcare? I mean, I think there's a couple of big reasons. I think all the way back to 2015. And even before that, but even if you just look back to 2015, where Hospira was having some issues with some of their pumps, FDA reached out and actually told hospitals that they could be breached. There was a vulnerability, and they could, actually harm patients if they were to use those pumps. And so subsequently, those pumps were pulled off of the market. And that was a wake-up call to the industry that cybersecurity is something we need to really consider and really need to bake into the medical devices. And around 2018 is when I started to work with FDA on pre-market guidance. They had already been thinking about software bill of materials, and we started to kind of put some content around what that could mean to the industry, what that transparency would mean in terms of protection. And, fast forward, here we are now with the FDA pre-market guidance becoming finalized, and then the legislative authority for FDA to enforce those requirements. And so, as Joe pointed out, regulations are getting more strict. They're requiring more information and more documentation, which just makes a lot of sense. Everybody wants to know what's running in their devices, and the SBOM will help us get there in terms of transparency.
You mentioned some of those, and I don't know if this acronym really is that popular, but the SOUP, Software of Unknown Provenance, I think as I remember it. Delano actually asked the question. Actually, I'll just share this with the screen so that we can maybe use this. What tools do you recommend to discover those vulnerabilities in the open source software? How do you recommend going about and discovering those?
I can take a crack at that first, and then Joe, you're welcome to jump in. I mean, I think there are open source tools that are available that will help you put together a list of ingredients or software components running in your software. Vigilant Ops also, we have our own generators, SBOM generators, that you can point at your open source code, and we can track all the vulnerabilities and associated components within that open source code. But there are things available today you can go out and find online. I think tools available, as I mentioned, if you want to automate that. I know there are lots of folks that are still doing kind of the manual process of kind of dumping their source and going through components, but that's really, really time intense, and you can't really track vulnerabilities against those components in a real good way manually. And so that's where a lot of the automation comes in. And as I mentioned, Vigilant Ops does the generation, but we also do the continuous tracking of vulnerabilities. So happy to help there.
Yeah, and I would chime in and say too, I think, Ken's spot on with that too, because when you look at software, right, you start thinking about the transitive dependencies of software too. So you need to be able to drill down, a little bit deeper than what you see it from the layer, right, the top layer. So I think that's where the struggle is when you start using some of these tools that are out there, like, some of the open source tools where they're not robust enough to really drill down and see some of those transitive dependencies in the software. So, tools like what Vigilant Ops has, again, it's excellent at doing that, right? Like looking at these open source libraries and seeing where they're actually sourced from. So I think that's the challenge that you have with a lot of software open source tooling is, not going down deep enough with these transitive dependencies of software.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So I'll kind of say, anyone who's listened to me very long, they've probably heard me talk about the 3 legs of a medical device company. It's my little mini speech where you have to be legal, you have to be ethical, and you need to be economically viable. And usually when we say legal, I lump regulatory compliance in there, and people assume if you're legal, then you're safe. But really, that's the second leg in my mind. They don't always overlap. The ethical is really where you build a device that you'd be willing to let your son or your daughter use. And I'll try to tie this together with maybe the second part of this discussion. In my mind, there's a regulatory reality. We talk about this compliance just as a foundational thing, and I'll use the FDA's refuse to accept policy, which now requires cyber documentation up front. What common missteps do you see medical device companies making as they try to get these expectations, either missing the RTA requirements, or maybe they meet them, but they're not truly covered from a cybersecurity. Those are two different, scenarios, but I don't know if you'd want to start the conversation there about that, Joe.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because I think some of the things that I see is like, kind of like I have a list, right, which is like inclusion of cyber in the QMS, right? So that's one thing that I see quite a bit. Also, the establishment of like cyber risk management, right? That's not included. And then also the requirements, cyber risk requirements and vulnerability disclosure, right? Things like that. And then also any kind of design. Well, I'd say design verification, cybersecurity design verification are some of the keys that I see missing, and and also some, I guess, some missing data in an SBOM too would be part of it too.
Yeah. No, I'll add a little bit. No, I agree with you, Joe. That's correct. I feel I see the same things. I also, one of the things that I think we encounter a lot with medical device manufacturers and customers of ours, even that. The amount of risk in a device, at least if you go back 10 years, right, and before cybersecurity became kind of what it is today and mandated by the requirements and the regs. And, I think folks are still kind of looking at it as, well, okay, my device doesn't connect to the network, or my device, is not hackable because of these things. And so they kind of downplay that risk. And I think there's a lot of still mistakes being made around the amount of risk that's in the device, and trying to kind of talk your way through not needing to supply some of this documentation. And I think that's a misnomer in nearly all the cases that I've seen where cybersecurity documentation is required for nearly everything. If you look at the definition of a cyber device, it's so broad and encompasses so much stuff that it's very, very unlikely that you'll have a device that doesn't need cybersecurity documentation. So when you're err on the side of caution and say, we got to, take this cybersecurity piece seriously, FDA is going to really be rigorous about looking at this. And so we have to go through the planning. We have to look at the monitoring after it's on the market. All those things have to be thought of ahead of time before you even think about talking to FDA, or else I think that could be a problem.
Yeah. And maybe I'll ask this question again too, because I think about the difference. Is there, or maybe I'll just ask you this: is there a difference in your mind between compliance and security maturity? And if you think yes or no, I'm curious what the difference looks like in between doing the bare minimum versus building a robust security program. Any comment there, Ken?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and one we always kind of talk about, right? Is cybersecurity is not a check the box feature. It's not something that you are going to do one time and forget it. It's not, it's not this. I got to get this done as quickly, and once I have it behind me, I'm good. This is an ongoing, evergreen process, and it's continuous, right? And so, baking it in. Building up processes around this, making sure they're scalable and efficient, and that's why we talk about tools that help automate a lot of this, because there's a lot of vulnerabilities out there. We know, I mean, 75, I think, plus per day being added to the already mountain of vulnerabilities that are out there, and going through that needle in the haystack kind of exercise every time is futile and not efficient, right? And so, if you, as an organization, if you kind of look at this as I just got to get through this, and then we're good, you're making a huge mistake, right? This has to be ongoing, continuous, evergreen, and you got to worry about products once they're on the market, prior to the market, and all that. And automation is the way that's really going to help you get there. Otherwise, you're going to be continuously trying to play catch up.
Yeah, makes sense. You have anything to add there, Joe?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think, what I see a lot is you got to look at it from a total product lifecycle perspective, right? And then also, don't, the old adage, right? Don't bolt on security like after the fact, right? Build it right into the design. And so, when you look at it that, like Ken said, automation, right? Because if not, you are going to be playing catch up, and, that's not the game you want to play, right? You want to be right in the middle of it and making sure that you look at the total product lifecycle from a concept all the way to end of life, right? And post-market surveillance. I think, I see a lot of, people focus on the pre-market aspect of a device, right? Life cycle, but you got to look at it from the total product life cycle and look at post-market surveillance as well.
Yeah. I'm just going to kind of move to an audience question real quick. I have a ton of questions myself, but I've got to be a little bit more generous here than that. So Karen Deep Singh Badwal actually asked the question, how are you finding medical device companies going about training employees on cybersecurity, if at all? What are your thoughts there? I see you nodding, Ken, so I'm going to just ask you first.
Yeah, that's a great question. If you think about traditionally or historically, medical device companies, right, have been worrying about patient safety for ever since the beginning, right? I mean, FDA has really been pushing patient safety for obvious reasons, right? And cybersecurity is more kind of newer to the game, right? Once we figured out we have these medical devices are actually computers in some sense that are networked, right? And they have vulnerabilities, and we worry about the risk. This is a little bit newer, and so medical device manufacturers are still, in a lot of ways, educating themselves on developing more secure software for their own, devices. And so it's an interesting challenge. And if you think about going forward and how resources are being trained, specifically to the question, a lot of it has been in the past trial by fire. I remember walking into a situation where we discovered our first vulnerability, and it was in the wild, and we had to do something about it, and we created a patch, and we went through all this process, and over time you kind of learn that. But now there are lots of ways you can do that. You can run incident response planning and testing ahead of time. You can do. I participated in this a few years back with the government, U.S. government, and the Homeland Security in running a simulated breach attack on healthcare, and looking at how we responded as a company, as an organization, and as a sector. Those kind of tests can help you ahead of time. And you help train your organization in their specific role when it comes to an incident like a breach, or protecting your products ahead of time. So the engineers learning more about secure practices and developing software, architecturally developing more sound products. That's all training that can be given to their engineering side. So I think there's lots of ways you can train the folks to kind of get them up to speed ahead of time.
Okay. Yeah, I've talked to some different companies, and I think there's a misunderstanding sometimes that if somebody's a software developer, there's almost an assumption that they have some cybersecurity, which is that's hard for me to imagine that actually the case, and you guys can confirm or deny that. But I'm curious. So let's say there's a company out there that maybe they don't yet have in-house cybersecurity expertise, and they're not engaging with a consultant on this practice. Are there any proactive risk assessments or threat modeling practices you recommend for those teams that maybe don't have those things in place yet, and kind of start those practices? Joe, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of resources available out there, right? I think one of the things that when I speak to companies, I do a lot of training as well, right? And so what I tell them is like, go out there and seek some of these resources that are out there from either the FDA or also, attend some of the conferences that are out there and some of the training that's out there on things like threat modeling, right? So because there's a gap, right, when you look at it. I also, back to Ken's answer too. I think with the you look at it from a software development perspective with the software engineers, it is a shared responsibility where you find even at the C-suite level, right? Everybody should be trained, right? Everybody should be trained on third-party risk and all these different things that come into play. So it's a shared responsibility for everybody to get involved in cybersecurity, not just the software engineers that I see the gap in, but I also see it in regulatory quality folks, and also at, like I said, at the C-suite level. So there's training out there available and resources available for everybody. Everybody has a seat at the table when it comes to cybersecurity.
Yeah, and Joe, I love that point. And just to follow that up, I mean, I think it was in a past webinar that we did probably together. We talked about how within an organization, even like the large organizations that are siloed by functionality, that in the old days, cybersecurity would get thrown over the wall. To your point, to the engineering team, and it's no longer just confined to engineering. I mean, it impacts the entire organization. So exactly what you said, the legal department needs to worry about it. The compliance folks worry about it. Regulatory folks worry about it. That everybody's got to get involved. It's a corporate or enterprise-wide problem. So I agree with you 100%. There should be some enterprise-wide training with respect to their specific role in cybersecurity, because it is no longer hey, we have a vulnerability, let's throw it over to engineering. It's something everybody has to worry about. Yeah, it's a good point.
I work for a CEO. I don't think he'd mind me saying his name, Mike Hooven. He was total respect for this guy. He's in his office. He kept a white hat, even though we were working on a drug delivery combination product that was purely mechanical. I mean, we had some connected devices coming down the line, and he kept a white hat on a display case in his office to remind himself that cybersecurity is such a big deal, and he had certain experiences that had led him to become a believer in that. So I think that's interesting, Joe. You both really pull it out, even at the C-suite. This is something that they need to be aware of and be sort of a practitioner of. If we, I'm curious what your thoughts are then. Well, actually, I want to kind of bend this or weave this question in from Jim. When we talk about these different risks from a cybersecurity standpoint, how do you see these being documented? Or is this a combination with the typical risk harms matrix that you might see in ISO 14971? And I'm actually going to try to add another element here. If I'm saying your name correctly, Torbjorn from the comments asked about ISO standards like ISO 81001, I think it's -5-1. Some people are suggesting that maybe that is going to replace ISO 14971 with its just level of importance. But I wonder what your thoughts are with the standards and how you recommend going about documenting these things.
Yeah, I could take that one too. So, for me, it's like, I look at it from, 81001-5-1. I think that's one of the main go-to documents, right? The FDA had put that out there to use that. They put that in their frequently asked questions section of use this in conjunction with the eStar template, right? When you make your submissions for documentation. The other thing too is when you look at this, it's a crosswalk of standards, right? You're not just looking at 14971. You're looking at all the guidance documents that come along with it. And I think the confusion is in the guidance documents, right? People are like, well, they're a guidance document. Do I really have to follow those? Yeah, the FDA, the notified bodies, right, and the regulators look at it and say, hey, you should be following these guidances. That's the expectation that they want you to follow, right? And like I said, it's a crosswalk of standards, 14971. The technical information reports like TIR 57, right, for pre-market cybersecurity, right, which looks at it from security impacting safety, right, and then also in the post-market TIR 97. So there's a bunch of different things that you have to look at, not just one standard, but a bunch of standards, regulations, and frameworks. Even the NIST frameworks that come into play, like NIST 218 now, right, with secure software development. All these things come into play now. It's just not one standard. So when I look at this question and people say, should I just be focusing on 81001? You got a lot of different things you got to look at when it comes to standards and regulations, right? To make sure your product is compliant with all the standards, regulations, and other applicable things that you need to for a submission, right? So that's the way I look at it, Ken. I don't know what you've seen as well.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. There's lots of moving parts, as you said. And one of the things, just to kind of hone in on a little bit of that, I mean, if you look at one of the things we're seeing, especially from customers, is some of the AMI references or AMI framework documents, the TIR documents that recommend various frameworks folks are implementing in a lot of ways and maybe have them implemented already. So for example, I'll give you a good example of a crosswalk. So if you think about security and safety, right? There's the cybersecurity aspect of it, but then there's the patient safety or patient harm aspect of it, right? And you look at those combined matrices that show you the score that takes into fact the patient harm of that vulnerability. That's your perfect crosswalk of security and patient safety. And folks should be looking at that. If they don't have that already baked in, we support that in our platform today, and our customers are using that to actually get through that manual exercise of crosswalking, as Joe pointed out, this security with safety. And that's something to keep in mind as you're looking at all these frameworks, right? There are frameworks out there that apply really well in the medtech space that weren't written for medtech specifically, but you can take a lot of that framework and leverage it in medtech. So I think there's a lot of good sources. Joe named a bunch of them, practically all of them. I think also I'd throw in a couple of the obvious ones, like the FDA pre-market guidance is a great, there's a lot of stuff in there that tells you about other sources you should look at as well. So yeah, it's good answer, Joe.
There's another question from Eric Bash, and I think it's relevant. We're kind of talking about the FDA quite a bit. You did mention notified bodies, but are there similar documents that establish these expectations, or maybe they're the same documents for other markets such as the EU? And can you comment on some of the requirements for the EU?
Yeah, I can jump in, and Joe, I'm sure, can comment as well. So yeah, I mean, specifically, so I think about, well, just let me speak globally, and then we can hone in on
Sure.
specific regions. But globally, what I've seen, so I'm the chair of a global cybersecurity working trade group that what we do is we align regulatory requirements, at least we work to try to align regulatory requirements around the world. So commercial organizations that are selling around the world can kind of manage to these standards or expectations in other regions. What I've seen most is a kind of most folks aligning around what you see FDA doing as a good example. So FDA requiring SBOM, post-market monitoring, those kind of things other regions have adopted, some earlier than others. I think Health Canada adopted software bill of materials a few years back. And I look at the EU, somebody brought up EU specifically. The MDR has requirements in there for tracking and looking at vulnerabilities. I think the latest stuff with the Cyber Resilience Act, which now applies that not just to medtech, but across all verticals, requiring tracking software components in all verticals, is another good example of regulations kind of marching in lockstep towards that transparency, which SBOM is providing. I know Japan is pushing really hard to make their way towards the same conclusion. We want SBOMs. They need to be part of medical device submissions. You need to plan this post-market monitoring. And so I think the biggest takeaway in summary is what I see is around the world happening is kind of an expansion of what we see happening in the US with FDA. The requirements becoming more stringent and being more regulated and enforced.
Yeah, I typically see the same thing as well. Like I said, I'm kind of falling in lockstep with the FDA, right? People looking at all those different aspects of how the FDA handles cybersecurity and SBOM. So I'm seeing it in Japan. MDSAP is following along with that as well. Medical device single audit program, they're doing that, all those participants. And then also, like I said, in Canada, I'm seeing quite a bit of it too. Like in, the EU Resiliency Act is really like driving everybody to look at SBOM differently now, right, as well.
Exactly.
Yeah. Before we get into the tools and tactics in SBOMs, and I want to talk about those, I am curious if you have any thought about how can cybersecurity be balanced with usability, especially when you think about life critical scenarios where delays or false alarms can have clinical consequences. Any thoughts there when it comes to a balance being like over secure and tight versus some of the looseness that we need to really just get through these situations? What are your thoughts? Ken, you want to start?
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and it's a tricky balance, right? I mean, healthcare and medtech specifically is different from other verticals in that sense that you have immediate access to a patient or to harm a patient, right, connected to a device, and so you have to be really careful, how you kind of implement these practices, right? You can't implement something that's so stringent that requires multiple logins and folks delaying access to a piece of equipment that's needed in an emergency, but then you can't be so lax to leave it open that anybody could just walk up to it or hack into it from remote distance, right? So there's that balance that has always been there, right? Medical devices, if you look at an OR or look at a scanner in an OR, technicians don't really like to go up to a scanner and have to type in passwords multiple times or go through multi-factor authentication. If they've got a patient on the table and they're trying to do a scan, they just want to do that quickly, right? And so, device manufacturers continuously struggle with, but I think you can do this. A lot of it can be done, as we talked about and Etienne brought up earlier, is, you got to push this design element cybersecurity element up into the design of the product itself. Start thinking about it from the very beginning, making it more secure, trying to take that burden off of the end user. There are ways you can make the product more secure without burdening the end user more. And I think those things need to be thought about ahead of time. Joe brought up the bolt-on. You don't want to bolt on cybersecurity because that's when you run into issues where customers don't like it, right? You just add some layer of security that involves everybody having to take more time to get into your system, and that's not a good thing. So you got to think about it ahead of time. I think that really, that design element will help you kind of get through a lot of that. But it's still, at the end of the day, you'll have that balancing act where you'll have to weigh that security versus the kind of access or utilization.
Yeah. Joe, your thoughts?
Yeah, I also look at it too from an operational technology standpoint too, right? Because you got these other things that are involved too, like these are interconnected devices, right? So the environment that they're operating is crucial too. So how they play nicely together in that environment is crucial as well, right? So you want to make sure that you have controls in place that are not too strict for the actual device, but you also have to have take in consideration the environment in which they operate in. So I look at also the OT side of it as well, right? As well as the actual device itself. So how you putting controls in place for that too. So when that device operates in that environment, what other controls do you need to put in place for it to operate safely and effectively and securely?
Yeah. Let's get into some of the tools and tactics that we've been talking about a little bit. And we mentioned these a little bit at the beginning, but SBOMs are becoming a hot topic, or they've been a hot topic for a couple of years now. But when is the right time to begin generating and maintaining one? And what's the cost of waiting too long? Joe, you wanna touch on that?
Yeah, I think the sooner the better, right? I think it's almost like when we were talking about, secure by design, if you will, right? I think you got to start looking at an SBOM early through the process. And I also, Ken and I talk about this a lot. It's the total product life cycle, or the complete SBOM, right? So you have to really think about it from that aspect too. Not only from, the onset from pre-market, but as you traverse through the life cycle of the product, how you're going to maintain the SBOM. So I think it's crucial that you look at it from the very beginning of your journey, like how are we going to tackle SBOM? That's the way, that's how I see as the biggest challenge where do you start your SBOM journey? And I always recommend at the very beginning.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree. I think it's difficult to argue that you need to wait until you're farther along in the life cycle of the product or in the development cycle. I think starting as early as you can with SBOM is just beneficial to everyone. I mean, even looking at components that you're thinking about putting in there, even during the design phase, you can look at vulnerabilities associated with those components and decide, I'm going to wait till the next version. I need a patch before I put this in, whatever that decision is, right? But those security decisions now, at least the questions, let's say, are being asked earlier, and that's really, really important because now you're thinking about it as part of the design of the product and overall life cycle of the product. And to Joe's point, if you look at a product not only as it's being developed in-house, but then once it's deployed to the field, we look at products in the field, and we call that drift whenever they kind of drift away from their original implementation, right? They have a posture. They have the software that was installed in the beginning doesn't look exactly like the software that's installed on there today for various reasons. Maybe patches were applied advertently or inadvertently. People have done security updates or whatever to those systems, right? And now you've got this disparity in what you thought was on there and what is actually on there. And so that's why that post-monitoring or post-market monitoring is really, really important. So you can understand where your devices are in any given time with respect to their security lifecycle. And so Joe made the great point all the way through the product lifecycle. So that's design all the way through to deployment.
So that's when to start it. I'm curious if you could touch on how to start it. And I'm going to give you a quick example of something outside the medical device industry, just a little bit removed. In 2020, we had the Hospital Transparency Act where hospitals had to put their prices on their website. And so the way they did that was they would put a JSON file or some very heavy CSV file far in the footer, and if you go look at that, no layperson you're not tech savvy, you can't decipher a JSON file. I mean, you got to figure out how to do that. Who's doing that? And I'm curious if something similar has happened with medical devices where you have to have an SBOM. So what's the purpose of the SBOM? Maybe we could talk about that. If a hospital, if you're marketing to a hospital and to weave into their internet of medical device things versus just direct to consumer where you have an app on your phone, Can you talk about the SBOMs? And because one of the polls was, what type is it? Is it an Excel spreadsheet? Is it this type of SBOM? Can you talk a little bit how it's actually built and what the actual purpose we're trying to accomplish with it? Do you want to? I don't know. Someone want to volunteer to begin? I'm sure you both could really hit this one hard, but
yeah, I'll let Ken take that one, and I can chime in.
Sure.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, that's a great point, and I love the question that came in through the chat. I think if you look at it, to your point, Etienne, there's some obfuscation that's happening, right? Folks are saying, well, we'll give you an SBOM, but we're going to make it a PDF, or we're going to give you an SBOM, but to your point, it's a JSON file, and good luck deciphering that. Well, that's not really helpful. I mean, in terms of transparency, and hospitals they have staffs, they have CISOs that look at security across these devices and really need to know at the right level what component vulnerabilities exist in the equipment that they deploy. And so they're asking for SBOMs in formats that they can use, they can ingest on their side and actually make actionable. And so as an organization starting off with you probably will start off doing something manually. And this is what we've seen from an SBOM lifecycle perspective is, you start off manually kind of tracking these components, understanding some vulnerabilities, and it probably is a spreadsheet to start with. You'll quickly outgrow that and say, this can't scale, I can't keep doing this. So you'll look for some automation and ways to make those tools, bring in some tooling to do that in a little better way. And then somewhere along the line, your consumers will ask you to please share that with them. And you can't give them, some folks might want to give them first level information about components and vulnerabilities, depending on what they're asking. Others might give a little more detail. But the idea, at some point, you'll be asked to share that information. I think it's happening more and more. Hospitals are asking for that information up front, even before they buy products. If they purchase the product and they're trying to support it, I've seen hospitals asking for discounts on support maintenance contracts for those products because they have no idea what's running in them, so they feel like they're going to spend more money on supporting them. And so, it just is beneficial to organizations to start thinking about this and getting that process in order, so you're actually creating some information that you can share that's actionable by your consumers.
Yeah, you're seeing a lot of these SBOM attestations, right, where people have to sign off on the SBOM. You're seeing quite a bit of that. That's kind of the new thing out right now, right? Where, like to Ken's point, right? If you want your software to be trusted, sign this attestation, right? So that's what I'm seeing a lot of. And I think in terms of the submission part of it for me is, I see a lot of difficulty there too, where they don't know how to actually generate the SBOM to share it, right? And so they have difficulty, maybe a PDF. And like to Ken's point, they start off with an Excel spreadsheet, and then it evolves into something else, and they start augmenting that with scripts, and it just becomes too overwhelming, right? And so you really need a tool in place that can actually generate that SBOM and get down to those transitive dependencies that I was talking about earlier.
Yeah, great points. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about how you would validate and manage the security of third-party libraries and the components in that device's software stack when it comes to that. And I know you kind of touched on this with your tool, Ken. If you want, we had, and I'll tell you where this is coming from. We actually had a question here from, if I'm saying your name correctly, Truklin Tron. Are there tools for assessing impact of human factor? Well, that's not the one I was looking for. I'm gonna back up for a second. I want to answer that question. Maybe we should just skip and go straight to that one instead. That's maybe a better question than what I'm asking. Do you want to touch on this? The tools for assessing the impact of human factors on cybersecurity.
Yeah, I can start with that, sure, and Joe can jump in. I mean, you think about threat modeling is a good assessment for as a tool that can kind of pull in the human factors. And I think one of the things that I mentioned earlier, just to kind of on that general point, that cybersecurity is different from safety, right? We're trying to accomplish the same thing. We're trying to keep the patient safe at the end of the day. But the way you kind of go about assessing cybersecurity risk is a little different, and you're thinking about it differently than you think about safety. So you're thinking about all the ways your device could be used to harm a patient, and that's a little different. And so you kind of go through these assessment scenarios, and that's why I mentioned threat modeling at the beginning. That can be used as a good tool to kind of help you think through the various ways that humans can interact with your device and the results of those interactions. I don't know if Joe has some ideas also. Stuff.
Yeah, good cybersecurity risk assessments, right, and threat modeling, like you mentioned. And I also look at it from the aspect that it might be, unintentional, right? So you also look at some of the aspects of that. It could be, malicious and unintentional. So you have to look at some of the risk controls and some of the mitigations that you're going to put in place for that. And like I said, I lean heavily on looking at, again, those guidance documents from, like if it's 24971, which has Annex F in it, which you can look at that annex in that particular that particular guidance document to 14971, which specifically addresses cybersecurity, right? And that annex. So look at it from that, and then again, all those TIRs that we talked about, 5797 and even 8001, right? So there's a lot of different standards that you could leverage that can help you out.
Yeah.
Oh, good point.
Okay, so this one, it's not the highest upvoted, but I think this is a really applicable question to a lot of people. So thank you, Kathleen, for asking it. She says, for a small startup with limited resources, if we're trying to apply the cybersecurity at the late stages of design just prior to submission, what would be the most practical approach to remediation? Understanding that it had obviously been ideal to start at the beginning, but the opportunity is lost. I imagine there are a lot of companies in this situation. What's the practical solution to this dilemma?
Joe, do you want me to take that one first? And
yeah, you can take that one. Yeah, go.
Yeah. So I would say, first thing you could do is get kind of an automation tool to help you generate an SBOM, even if it's if you haven't submitted yet. Generate the SBOM. Look for vulnerabilities in that product, in the components of that product, and kind of get an idea of where what the risk profile of that product is even before submitting to FDA. And that'll give you a good feeling for areas that you need to shore up or might need to shore up even prior to the submission. Even if you haven't done anything up to this point, at least you want to know your starting point, your starting location, so that you can then guide yourself from there.
Yeah, and I'll chime in and say I'll put my auditor's hat on for a second here, right? Because I do a lot of audits, and what I also recommend too is doing like a mock audit, right, of your cybersecurity posture, right? And that can include a lot of different things, right, to the standards like I mentioned earlier, and to the the guidance documents. But like Ken mentioned, going back and looking at some of those gaps that you might have in your SBOM, but also in your documentation that aligns with it, how you're handling metrics and monitoring that. A thorough gap analysis would I definitely recommend, right? So, and I do quite a bit of those, right, where I go back and you brought up a great point, right? A lot of folks are in this boat where they kind of miss over the design part of it and they try to bolt it on, like I mentioned earlier, and then like, we got to go back and start looking at things. So a thorough gap analysis of your cybersecurity posture is what I recommend.
Early in the conversation, Joe, you mentioned post-market surveillance. I'm curious if you could talk about what the role of continuous monitoring post-market surveillance play in modern cybersecurity and how manufacturers could prepare for like a lifetime of vigilance. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that's really great about, ISAOs, right? These information sharing organizations, I think like getting involved in that is part of a big piece of post-market surveillance, right? So ISAOs are out there. CISA has one as well, where they can share information and help you kind of, monitor, part of the monitoring of post-market surveillance, looking at these different cybersecurity threats that come in and having a good vulnerability disclosure program, things like that, right? There's got to be something in place. Like I said, I think a lot of teams focus on the pre-market aspect and they figured about, okay, once this thing gets into the market, what are we going to do next, right? And then you also start thinking about like, how are you going to support it, right? End of support, end of life, all those different things come into play. Again, that total product life cycle. So you got to look at it from that aspect, from a post-market surveillance standpoint. Like I said, vulnerability disclosure and also getting involved with, an ISAO is one of the things that can really help in the post-market space.
Great answer.
And just to segue onto that, I a couple of years back worked with the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, EUMDR, in creating a legacy device document. You can check that out. Actually, we can supply a link to it if you need it. But there's lots of good information there about supporting legacy devices and what you need to do. I mean, in each stage of the device's life cycle. So if it's newly deployed, all the way through to end of life. So there's lots of good as Joe mentioned, lots of good frameworks you can reference. EUMDR is just one of them as well.
Awesome. I'm going to say to the audience, we're going to close here in just a few minutes. We did not get to everybody's questions, and apologies for that. But what we'll do is I'll share all of these questions with Ken and Joe after the call. And if they're able to get to them, obviously they're very busy people as well, but if they're able to get to them, I'm sure they'll do that. So we will pass those questions on. We'll also look at those and try to inform future webinars so that try to answer some of those questions maybe in the future. Last question I'll ask, though. We talked a little bit about the past. We talked about where we are right now. If you were to say, where are we going to go from here? I hate to bring up AI because it comes in every conversation, I know, but AI and machine learning are becoming more integrated with medtech. I'm curious whether we want to touch that or we want to go a different direction. Regardless, what new cybersecurity risks do you foresee, and how do you suggest we start addressing them now? Joe, do you want to start?
That's a great question, right? I've heard a lot of buzz about, we've been talking about S-bomb, but now there's the AI bomb, right? That you got to start thinking about too, right? I mean, I hate to throw that out there, but it's kind of the elephant in the room, but I guess, you got to mention it, right? I think that's part of it, right? And I think as we get more and more into, leveraging AI for not only, using these large language models to actually help with mitigating risk and looking at vulnerabilities, but also they're embedded into these devices now, right? So we got to look at the threats that are going to come from that, whether it's AI poisoning or what have you, right? There's a lot of different things that we have to look at when it comes to AI. And like I said, I think you're going to see more of, that introduction of, like I said, that AI bomb. Yeah.
Great. I'd actually not heard that phrase yet, so I'm going to have to borrow that. But yeah, Ken, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, the AI bomb is, to Joe's point, it's in its infancy, but it's coming along, right? I mean, so we'll have different requirements. I think the formatting, hopefully the formatting will stay the same, so we can submit the data in the same way. But the data that we look for, the parameters and the content will be different from a software bill of materials because there's different stuff you have to worry about in an AI model than a software component. So that will make the difference. But some of so I think Vigilant Ops today has baked some of this advanced learning into our platform already in terms of vulnerability prioritization and helping folks sift through the thousands of vulnerabilities they encounter and looking at the impact on their specific device and giving them guidance as to which ones to go after first. I think that's a good first start. That's a good way to use AI to start, is to help on the engineering side and go after these vulnerabilities. I think to your point, Etienne, though, going forward, I think we need to be a little more proactive. I think we need to get out ahead of the curve and start to look at these things before they become vulnerabilities, right? And AI can help us there as well by looking for dependencies that we may or may not be able to ferret out, as humans, right? I mean, Joe mentioned transitive dependencies a couple of times, have dependencies on dependencies on dependencies that we may or may not be aware of or can't ferret out. Using AIs, language models to help you ferret those out is a good way to be proactive. And you can look at components that maybe are end of life that you didn't know about that you're using somewhere buried in your product, right? That's a good proactive way to do it.
I think that's really good advice. When I was in college, I remember the phrase, anyone can extrapolate, engineers interpolate. But I think now that we have a certain amount of AI as across industries, maybe we can start having some more accurate extrapolation. So definitely need to be utilizing that. Okay. Thank you so much, Ken and Joe, for both of your experience and being willing to be put on the spot in this almost Ask Me Anything session. Those of you listening, thank you for your patience with me, not necessarily getting to all of your questions. Like I said, I'll pass those on to Joe and Ken after the webinar, and they can do with them what they will. But I want to thank you so much, all of you, for the informative presentation, the valuable insights throughout today's webinar. As a reminder, we will be sending out today's recording and presentation slides, so keep an eye out for that if that's something of interest. And on behalf of Greenlight Guru, thank you all for attending today's webinar. I'll let you all get back to the rest. Oh, I forgot one thing. I do have a survey. I want to know what you thought of this. It's a little bit different layout than we typically have, so I'm just going to launch that right now. And if you have a minute to stick around and answer that survey, that'd be extremely helpful. But otherwise, I'll let you all get back to the rest of your day. Thank you so much. We'll see you all next time. Take care.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. All right.
And Ken and Joe, if you want to hit that button on the bottom right, leave stage, we can go backstage.